Chapter 17. After a long night with little sleep, JD packed his bags and headed downstairs to let the owner know that today would be his last day. The woman looked up from the counter as he descended the last step, and JD realized she really did resemble an older version of Callie. She had to be her mother, with the same dark hair and eye shape. Her eyes were more of a hazel color than the emerald green of Callie's, but the shape was the same. "Hello," he said as he approached. "I wanted to let you know that I'll be checking out today." Her smile faltered as her brow knitted together. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Is there anything we can do to make you want to stay?" He thought about asking about Callie right then. The words, "Can you set me up with your daughter?" jumped into his brain, beating against his throat to come out, but he swallowed them away. The woman would probably think he was a stalker if he uttered them. "No, thank you. It was wonderful. But I'll be staying longer and thought an apartment might be a little more convenient." The smile returned to her face at the realization that he wasn't dissatisfied with her inn or her service. "I can certainly understand that, though I'm still sorry to see you go." She clicked a few buttons on the computer to her right, and a small printer whirred to life, spitting out a single sheet of paper. Picking up the sheet, she glanced over it before sliding it across the countertop to him. "I just need you to fill this out." JD perused the charges. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so he initialed the lines and signed at the bottom. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," she said, picking up the paper. She glanced at the lines, and then her eyes widened. "I'm sorry, does this say JD Peterson?" A quiver of excitement laced her voice, and her eyes held the look of a kid at Christmas. "Yes, I'm JD Peterson." A smile broke out on her face before she could contain it, but just for a second. A blink of his eyes later and she had composed herself, and only the sparkle in her eyes remained, making him wonder if he'd imagined the whole thing. "And what time will you be leaving tonight? So I can have the cleaning crew do your room," she added hastily. "I should be ready to vacate by 6. 6, she repeated. "Wonderful." JD wondered at her odd behavior, but he had only an hour before he had to meet Cindy, and the rumbling in his stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten. So putting the incident out of his mind, he turned into the quaint dining room to grab some breakfast. 4 small circular tables covered in white tablecloths filled the room. This morning they were all empty. Everyone else must have eaten already. Dropping his coat over the back of one of the chairs, he grabbed a plate from the buffet table and filled it with food. He was going to miss this aspect. The woman was an amazing cook, presenting an array of delicious delicacies. This morning there was a green and gold quiche that smelled heavenly, some sort of breakfast casserole that reminded him of campfire meals, and a plate of homemade cinnamon rolls. Since it was his last day, he piled one of each on his plate. Might as well eat his fill. My phone buzzed again on my desk. Someone was sure insistent. The phone had buzzed at least 4 times since I had started reading this document, but I knew if I picked it up, I would be distracted and lose my place. When I finished the document, I picked up the phone. 4 text messages from my mother filled the screen. Was there an emergency? My mother never texted. She always said she hated the impersonal aspect of it. As I scrolled to the top to read the first message, my hand flew to my mouth. JD was at the inn? The last message stated that he was checking out and leaving at 6. I glanced at my watch. It was almost noon. If I worked through lunch and finished this research, I could leave at 4, which would give me a little time to clean up. The intercom buzzed as I hit the button. "Tina, I need you to order me in some lunch. I'm working straight through today." "It doesn't look like much, but it comes furnished. All it really needs is a woman's touch." Cindy leaned against the small bar in the kitchen and flashed a seductive smile. Instead of answering, JD turned away, pretending to consider the place again. All morning she had been dropping suggestive hints, blocking doorways so he had to touch her to walk by, dropping her hand flirtatiously on his arm as she pointed features out in the apartments, and now striking a seductive pose. It wasn't that she wasn't pretty. With her short dark hair and small build, she was nice to look at. But she wasn't Callie. "I'll take it," he said, partly because it fit the bill he was looking for, and partly because he didn't want to see another place with Cindy. While she drew up the papers, he perused the small apartment one more time. It wasn't anything grand, but it would do for as long as he was here. The front door opened to a spacious living room with plush beige carpet. A brown recliner and love seat filled the room, facing a medium-sized television. The kitchen had a direct view to the living room and was decorated in beiges and tans. The lone hallway led from the living room down to the bathroom and the one bedroom, both large enough for his needs. Cindy was right that it needed a woman's touch, and he couldn't help picturing Callie hanging pictures or helping him pick out throw pillows. "All done," she said in her sing-song voice. "Shall we celebrate?" He did want to celebrate, but not with Cindy. "I can't. I need to get my things from the bed and breakfast I was staying at." Her full lips formed a perfect pout. He wondered if she practiced the look in the mirror and how many men stumbled over themselves when she flashed it. "Well, another time then," she purred. "You have my number now, and I know where you live." He tried for a polite smile and shook her hand, hoping she'd pick up on the hint that he wasn't interested. With a final longing look at him, she handed over the keys, gathered her paperwork, and left. After locking the door to make sure she didn't return, JD collapsed on the love seat with a sigh. He needed to pick up some food from a grocery store to stock the fridge, but he could afford the rest for a moment. Avoiding Cindy's advances had been quite exhausting. I sat in the car, staring at the front of the inn. My heart was thudding in my chest and my throat felt like the Sahara Desert. In a moment, I would be face to face with JD for the first time in months. Would he still be interested in me now that I was pregnant? Only one way to find out. With a final deep breath, I stepped out of the car. The wind caught my hair, whipping it about my face. So much for the 30 minutes I had spent making sure every lock was in place. I shoved my hands deeper in my coat pockets as the chill in the air bit through my layers. Though it was a short walk up the steps, I found myself shivering as I reached for the door handle. "Callie?" The timbre of the voice behind me sent a tingle down my spine. I had missed that, the way he said my name. I turned around slowly. JD stood at the end of the sidewalk wearing a pair of jeans and a brown leather jacket. The wind tousled his hair as I longed to. "Hi, JD." I wanted to say more, to sound eloquent, but words failed me yet again. He took a step toward me, his eyes never leaving my face. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing." Pulling my coat tighter across my belly, I'd explain that to him later, I stepped down to the sidewalk. "I'm here for work." Another step. Only 3 steps separated us now. "My mother told me you were here, and I needed to see you before I lost you again." Only 2 steps remained. "Why?" 1 step. "What about Daniel?" "There is no more Daniel." A smile tugged at my lips and I covered the final distance, feeling the heat radiate off his body even as the wind blew against us. There hasn't been since a few weeks after I returned from the Caribbean. I could reach out and touch him now if I wanted, if I wasn't afraid he might bolt. The emotion in his eyes was unclear, but I hoped he was happy to see me. His eyes roamed my face, but he said nothing. I couldn't handle the silence. "I found your travel books and the picture when I got home. It sits on my nightstand. I've looked at it every night, wishing I had done things differently there. I should never have taken Daniel back. You were right, and I'm sorry." As conflicting emotions battled across his face, I wondered why. Was he seeing someone now? "What about the baby?" he asked. My eyes widened. "How did you know?" I had picked this coat particularly because it hid my baby bump. He stared at me. He clearly wasn't answering my question until I answered his. "I'll tell you all about it, but the father isn't in the picture." The wind found a hole in our electric current and nipped at me. I shivered, wishing he would take me in his arms. "So there's no one?" The small smile broadened as I shook my head. "No one but you, I hope." The words were barely out of my mouth before his right hand was in my hair, his left on the small of my back and his lips on mine. They were everything I had imagined, soft and firm and intense, like he couldn't get enough. The electricity traveled down my body, warming me against the chilly wind. He pulled back, his eyes wild. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Don't be sorry," I said, placing a finger on his lips. "I've wanted you to do that since the day at the falls." He brought my hand to his chest as he pulled me closer and met my lips again. The kiss was softer this time, slower, but no less full of emotion. When he pulled back, I could see that he was struggling to catch his breath just as I was. A tingling was still racing through my body, and my heart was beating so fast it was like a drum in my ear. A slow smile spread across his face. "I wanted to do that from the moment I saw you." We stood there at the end of the sidewalk with the wind whipping around us. He held both of my hands in his, and though the temperature was chilly, neither of us felt the cold. "I have so much to tell you," I finally said, breaking the magic spell for the moment. "But first I have to tell my mother I found you." "I get the feeling I owe your mother a thank you," he said, entwining his fingers with mine. "I think we both do." Hand in hand, we walked into the bed and breakfast. My mother stood at the counter, but her eyes were trained on the doorway. As we entered, her eyes lit up, and she hurried out from behind the counter. Her eyes landed on our clasped hands, and her smile magnified. "I take it this is the right JD, then?" I smiled up at the man I had only dreamed about, still unable to believe he was here next to me. "It is." "I assume I have you to thank for Callie showing up here," JD said. She shrugged. Mother has to do what she can." "Well, I truly thank you, but if you don't mind, I'm going to steal your daughter to dinner. I'm starving." With that, he whisked me back outside and into his car. Minutes later, we had parked at a quiet Italian restaurant. After opening my door, JD took my hand again and led the way inside. The building was small from the outside, but opened impressively inside. 10 tables and a few booths filled the dimly lit room. Candles glowed on every table, and soft light from the ceiling completed the ambiance. A young woman in a black skirt and starched white shirt greeted us and led us to the farthest booth. There weren't many other patrons in the restaurant, but the booth blocked out most of what little noise there was. It was almost like being in our own private world. JD reached for my hand again as soon as we sat down, but I didn't mind. My hands felt empty now if they weren't touching his. "I have so much I want to ask you," JD said. "Tell me what happened since you left the Caribbean." I took a deep breath. "That's quite a story, but I'll try. When Daniel and I returned from the trip, I started to see parts of his personality I didn't like. My face clouded as I remembered the ultimatum he had issued. When he found out I was pregnant, he said he didn't want the responsibility of being a parent. He wanted to be free to do what he wanted, so he forced me to choose between him and the baby. I chose the baby. He didn't want to raise his own child?" A heat seared across my face, and I dropped my eyes. I hadn't wanted to tell him so soon, but it was the perfect opportunity. "It's not his, but he didn't even know that, and he didn't want to raise the child. I knew I couldn't stay with someone like that." I bit my lip, hoping that the admission of my philandering behavior wouldn't scare him away. I looked up through lowered lids, but JD's face was passive. His hand still caressed mine, though. "The baby's not Daniel's." Though I had known he would ask the question, the actual words coming out of his mouth speared my heart. I had a bad night shortly after Daniel left me. I drank too much with a friend and ended up in the apartment of a guy I met that night. I've never done anything like that before, and I promise it will never happen again. The words spilled out in a rush. I was so afraid that he would get angry and leave before I had a chance to explain. "Callie, I'm not here to judge you. I've done some things I'm not proud of in my life, too." I wondered what he had done, but he didn't elaborate. "What matters to me is the father. Does he want the baby? Will he come back into our lives?" I shook my head slowly. He wasn't angry? I should have known. He was so different. Wait, did he say our lives? "I don't think so. I told him about the baby as soon as I knew, and he was not pleased. He signed away his parental rights, so even if he tries to come back, he has no standing." He nodded, and just like that, the discussion was over. I stared at him, my affection deepening. The waitress appeared with a tray of freshly baked bread, and I snatched one before it even had time to cool. I had been so nervous about meeting JD that I hadn't eaten much all day, and my stomach was definitely protesting now. Across the table, JD's lips pulled into a bemused smile. "Are you going to save some room for dinner?" A tingling swept up the back of my neck and across my face. I swallowed the bite in my mouth and put the rest of the bread down. "I'm sorry. I didn't eat well today, and I'm eating for 2 now." "Don't be sorry. I find it endearing." His voice was soft, his eyes steady on my face. Though I knew he was sincere, I wasn't used to someone looking at me the way JD was now. My eyes dropped to the tabletop, and the remainder of the bread I hadn't shoved in my mouth. "I've told you my story. Now tell me more about you. We never talked about what you did while we were in the Caribbean." JD took a sip of his water glass. "I manage my dad's companies because my dad had a heart attack a few years ago, and he decided to retire to Florida with my mom. We run a few Christian publishing companies. In fact, you should write about your story. I bet it would make a great book." The thought of sharing my story with complete strangers mortified me. I was still embarrassed by my choices and often felt people were looking at me, wondering where my ring was. But the verse about being a prophet pushed to the front of my mind. Could that have been the verse's cryptic meaning? Using my own mistakes to help others from making the same ones? I'll think about it. I smiled. So what were you doing in the Caribbean? You said you go there every year. The waitress interrupted the conversation to take our orders, and then JD continued. I do. I take brochures and books about Jesus that we've printed that year and distribute them down there. My dad used to do that every year when I was a kid, and so I sort of grew up there. Remember Sammy, who braided your hair? I nodded. What I remembered more than Sammy was the tingle I had felt at JD's touch, and the beginning sparks of attraction. Well, he also owns the bar I was working in that night we met, and he helps run a local church there that distributes our materials. I guess it's kind of like missionary work, except I only stay there for a couple of weeks. I give him the books, and he gives them out to the people. Wow, that's nice of your company. So, are you opening a publishing branch here? He chuckled. It was a deep, lovely sound, coupled with an even lovelier smile. No, I'm starting a pregnancy crisis center here. My eyebrows drew together, creating a stream of wrinkles across my forehead and nose. What does that have to do with publishing? Nothing, JD laughed. But the need for one's been weighing on my heart, and my father always taught me to listen to my heart's desire, because it's from God when it's also based on principles from His Word. So here I am looking into a place to open up a clinic to help pregnant women make the same decision you did. My eyes widened and I leaned forward. Sandra will be so excited. She's been praying for a local clinic. And I want to help your clinic. Whatever you need. Well, whatever you need that I can do with a baby on the way. I think you look even more beautiful with a baby on the way. The glow suits you. While you were stunning then, you don't even look like the same woman I met in the Caribbean. I'm not. My gaze dropped to our entwined hands and then back up at him through lowered lids. You were right. Having a relationship with God changes you. Before JD could reply, the waitress returned with our plates, setting down a delectable chicken Alfredo in front of me and a large plate of lasagna in front of JD. My mouth watered as the aroma wafted up to my nose. This time I joined JD when he prayed over dinner. When the prayer ended, I filled my fork with pasta. The creamy Alfredo sauce flowed like honey down my throat, and before I knew it, my plate was empty. As JD still had half of his lasagna, I reached my fork onto his plate and scooped up a bite. Hey, what do you think you're doing? He asked. Helping you out? I smiled and brought the forkful to my mouth. Though I wasn't the biggest lasagna fan, it too was delicious. JD shook his head, a smile playing at his lips. As I watched him finish eating, I pictured my life with him. An image of the two of us in the kitchen cooking while a small child played at our feet filled my mind. He turned to kiss me before I leaned down to scoop up the child. What are you thinking? JD asked. His voice shattered my daydream and a blush spread across my cheeks. I didn't want to tell him about the daydream, not yet at least, not until I knew for sure how he felt. Nothing, I said. I just can't remember when I had a nicer dinner. Me either. What does the JD stand for? Though I hadn't been curious when we met, I had often wondered over the last few months when I thought about him. This time the question jumped out before I could stop it. He smiled at the odd request. Jonathan Daniel. I blinked at him, sure that I had heard him wrong. What is it? He asked. Do you remember the day back in the Caribbean when I told you I prayed? He nodded, and I continued. Well, I prayed for God to send Daniel back to me. It appears he answered my prayer, only with a different Daniel than I thought. I told you he works in mysterious ways, JD said. His broad smile perfectly matched the feeling coursing through my body. He finished his plate, and when the bill came, JD picked up the tab. I tried to protest, but he reminded me that I would be taking a pay cut, at least for a while when I went on maternity leave. The cold hit again as soon as we stepped outside, and I shivered. The sun had set while we ate, and the temperature had cooled even more. JD wrapped his arm around my shoulder, pulling me closer to him. I basked in the warmth and security he offered. He allowed the car to idle a minute, letting the heater warm up. Shall I take you back to the inn? I wanted to say no. I wanted him to come home with me so I could stay wrapped in his arms. An unnatural fear that this was all a dream and I would lose him again had settled on my shoulders, and I longed for his reassurance. I suppose that would be best, I said instead. I knew he wouldn't have come, even if I asked. I do have work tomorrow, but will you come over after I get off? I'd love to, he said, and the fear abated. I nestled down in the seat, letting my mind wander again as we drove off. The end was close, and too soon we had arrived. Before my hand touched the handle, he was out of his side of the car and opening my door. I had never felt more like a princess. His warm hand enveloped mine, pulling me up from the car into his chest. His arms wound around my waist, and as if on instinct, my arms encircled his neck. JD's eyes were bright, full of emotion and unsaid words. My lips parted and my face turned up to his. An invisible current seemed to run between us, pushing his face closer to mine until our lips met. As the kiss deepened, my hands tightened around his neck, and his arms pressed me tighter against him. I felt molded to his body, a perfect fit. Though desire was running rampant through my body, and it would have been easy to get back in the car and head to my place, I forced myself to sever the kiss. This time was going to be different, but I couldn't help feeling pleased that he was just as breathless as I was. Good idea, he said, shaking his head. I could lose myself with you. He placed a final soft kiss on my lips and then headed to his own car. I took those words to bed that night. We both had agreed to wait on an intimate relationship, but I couldn't keep my mind from wandering. Clad in my favorite oversized t-shirt, I curled up in bed, imagining JD beside me. I had never felt sexier or more desired. My hand absently rubbed my belly and hoped moved against it. I don't want to jinx it, little one, but I think he could be the one.